This was Leo, Alastair Sterling's 7-year-old son, and the silent, gravitational center of the sprawling, empty penthouse. He wasn't reading or playing with a tablet. His hands were tucked under his legs, and his gaze was fixed on a single mote of dust turning lazy circles in a lonely shaft of afternoon sun. His hair, the same dark shade as his father's, was a messy testament to a restlessness that had no outlet. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, weighted with everything that went unsaid. Anya had been in the Sterling residence for 3 days. 3 days of polishing surfaces that were already spotless, of straightening cushions no one sat on, of erasing the minimal evidence that people even lived here. In those 3 days, she had not heard the boy speak a single word. She had, however, heard the echoes of his distress, the faint sounds of a tantrum from his bedroom, the sharp, frustrated tones of a nanny who had quit that very morning, the strained, clipped phone calls between Mr. and Mrs. Sterling about next steps and specialists. "You're not here to connect, you're here to clean." The words, sharp and sterile as the room they were spoken in, came from Mr. Alastair Sterling. He stood silhouetted against a floor-to-ceiling window, a pane of glass that framed the sprawling city below as his personal kingdom. His suit was a shade of charcoal so dark it seemed to absorb the light, tailored with a precision that left no room for error, much like the man himself. He hadn't turned to look at her when he spoke. His attention was fixed on the distant, glittering towers, a landscape of ambition he had helped conquer. Anya, the new maid, stood in the center of the vast living room, her presence a soft, quiet counterpoint to the room's hard edges and polished surfaces. Her uniform was a simple, functional gray, designed to be overlooked, to blend into the shadows between the gleaming marble floors and the stark white walls. She held a small silver tray. On it sat a single porcelain cup from which a gentle wisp of steam rose, carrying the faint, sweet scent of warm cocoa. She did not flinch or offer an excuse. A lifetime of service had taught her that stillness was its own form of armor. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of his rule. Her eyes, however, drifted past the imposing figure at the window to the small boy curled on a white leather sofa that was large enough to be a bed. Mr. Sterling saw dirt, smudges, and disorder as his enemies. Anya saw a different kind of mess. She saw the profound disarray in the soul of a little boy who had everything but the one thing he needed. She moved with a quiet grace, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the polished concrete floor. She approached the low marble table beside the sofa where Leo sat, her movements slow and deliberate, the way one might approach a frightened bird. She gently placed the cup of cocoa on a coaster, not so close as to startle him, but near enough that its warmth might cross the cold gap between them. Alastair Sterling finally turned, his eyes, the color of slate, narrowing slightly. "The nutritionist handles his diet," he said, his voice clipped. "Your duties do not extend to the kitchen nor to him. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Anya replied, her own voice soft, barely disturbing the air. She did not look at him. Her focus remained on the boy. What must it be like, she wondered, to be so small in a world of such towering, cold objects? To have a father who managed a global empire, but could not manage a simple, kind word. Anya had raised 2 of her own, in a home that was a fraction of the size of this single room, but it had been filled with a warmth that this penthouse could never contain. The memory of her children's laughter was a phantom limb, an ache she carried with her always. Would you endure this? The question surfaced in her mind, a quiet murmur of empathy. Could you stand in this gilded cage day after day and watch a child slowly fade into the wallpaper? Then see to the guest suites on the West Wing. "Mrs. Sterling is hosting a charity luncheon tomorrow. I expect perfection." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his attention already captured by the vibrating phone in his palm, the king returning his focus to his kingdom. Anya bowed her head slightly and turned to leave. As she walked away, she didn't look back, but she was acutely aware of the small cup of cocoa sitting on the table. It was an offering, a small, warm gesture in a world of cold transactions. It was a breach of her stated duties, a quiet act of defiance against the first rule of this silent house. She cleaned the guest suites with meticulous care, her hands steady and practiced. She wiped away invisible fingerprints, plumped pillows, and ensured every surface reflected the light with cold, impersonal brilliance. She was a ghost, a pair of hands, a function. That is what they paid her to be. But as she worked, her mind was back in the living room with the boy and the dust mote and the cup of cocoa. She wondered if he would drink it. She wondered if he would feel the warmth of the cup and know that someone in this vast, empty space saw him. Not as a problem to be solved, not as the heir to an empire, but as a small boy who looked terribly, terribly alone. Later that evening, as she was collecting trash from the living room, she saw the cup. It was still on the coaster, but it was empty now. Beside it, on the polished marble, was a small, dark ring of dried chocolate, and next to that, a single, tiny fingerprint. Anaya's heart gave a gentle, hopeful flutter. She wiped the table clean, erasing the evidence. But some things, once they happen, can't truly be erased. A connection, however small, had been made. And in a house built on rules of disconnection, that was a dangerous, powerful thing. In the Sterling penthouse, invisibility was a carefully curated aesthetic. The staff moved like whispers, their presence felt only by the results of their labor, a gleaming surface, a refilled glass, a folded blanket. Anaya learned the rhythm of this invisibility quickly. She learned the specific hum of the climate control system, the faint click of the elevator arriving at the private floor, the precise angle of the sun as it bisected the living room at 3 p.m. She became a part of the house's quiet, mechanical heartbeat. The other staff, the chef who spoke only to list the day's menu, the security detail who communicated in curt nods, treated her as another piece of the expensive, silent machinery. They saw her uniform, not her. Around her neck, tucked neatly into the collar of her gray dress, Anaya wore her own small comfort, a simple, worn cotton scarf. It was imbued with the faint, clean scent of lavender from the small sachet she kept in her dresser drawer. The scarf was a soft, private tether to her own life, a world away from this sterile opulence. It was a piece of her that had not yet been scrubbed clean and polished into anonymity. When the loneliness of the vast, empty rooms pressed in on her, she would subtly lift her chin and inhale, the familiar scent a momentary anchor. Anaya was more than a cleaner. She was a student of quiet observation. She watched Leo from a distance, cataloging the small, heartbreaking details of his isolation. She noticed how he flinched at sudden noises, how he lined up his dinosaur toys in a rigid, unchanging order, how he would press his forehead against the cold glass of the window for hours, watching the city move without him. These were not the actions of a spoiled, difficult child, but of a child navigating a landscape of deep, internal trauma. She saw the tremor in his hands when his father entered a room, the way his shoulders would hunch as if expecting a blow, even when the words were not directed at him. One afternoon, while she was dusting the grand piano in the music room, an instrument no one ever played, Anaya began to hum. It was a soft, wordless lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, a melody that felt like warm hands and safety. She hummed for herself, a small act of self-soothing in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, a voice sliced through the air. "Must you?" Mrs. Sterling stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. Her silk dressing gown shimmered, making her look both ethereal and severe. "This is a place of work, not, whatever that is, keep the noise down." Anaya's humming stopped instantly. A flush of heat crept up her neck. She looked down at her hands, at the feather duster she held. For a brief moment, her fingers tightened around the handle, her knuckles white. A storm of words raged behind her teeth, words about how a little music might be the first kind thing this house had heard all week, about how a boy down the hall was starving for a sound that wasn't sharp or angry. But she swallowed them all. A quiet sigh, barely audible, was her only release. She gave the same small, practiced nod she had given her husband. "My apologies, madam," she murmured to the floor. Mrs. Sterling watched her for a moment longer, her expression one of vague distaste, as if she'd just found a scuff mark on her favorite shoes. Then she turned and swept away. The humiliation was a bitter, familiar taste. It was the price of her employment, the tax on her dignity. "Would you tolerate this?" she asked the silent room. "Would you allow your voice, your very breath, to be deemed a disturbance, a piece of clutter to be tidied away?" Anaya took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of lavender from her scarf. It was a reminder that beneath the gray uniform she was still herself. Her spirit was her own. She was more than the silence they tried to wrap her in. And it was in that silence that she noticed everything. She saw the cracks in the flawless facade of the Sterling family, and she saw the little boy who had fallen through them. The screaming began just after 2 a.m. It wasn't a child's cry for attention or a simple nightmare. It was a raw, primal sound of terror that clawed its way through the thick walls and soundproofed floors of the penthouse. Anea sat bolt upright in her small, Spartan room in the staff quarters. The sound was visceral. It bypassed her ears and went straight to the maternal core of her being. She could hear the frantic scurry of footsteps from the main residence, the sharp, panicked voices of Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, the deeper tones of the night security guard speaking into his radio. This was the meltdown, the one the departing nanny had warned her about. Anea pulled on her robe, her hands moving with a purpose that felt ancient and instinctual. She walked quietly down the hall, a shadow moving toward the source of the pain. The door to Leo's room was open, spilling a chaotic scene into the hallway. Leo was in the corner of his room, his small body rigid, his hands over his ears. He was screaming, his eyes shut tight against a world that had become too much to bear. His parents stood helplessly in the middle of the room, their authority utterly useless. "Leo, stop at this instant," Mr. Sterling commanded, his voice a useless hammer against the boy's wall of terror. "The therapist said not to engage him when he's like this," Mrs. Sterling countered, her voice thin and frayed. "Just let him tire himself out." They were talking about him as if he were a faulty appliance. Anea watched for a moment, her heart aching. They saw a behavioral problem. She saw a child drowning. She slipped into the room unnoticed. They were too focused on the storm, they didn't see the calm approaching. She didn't speak. She didn't try to touch him. She simply moved to the other side of the room near the window and sat on the floor, tucking her legs beneath her. And then she began to hum. It was the same lullaby from the music room. A melody with no sharp edges, a sound that asked for nothing in return. She hummed it softly, her eyes on the boy, her presence a gentle, unwavering beacon in his hurricane of fear. At first, nothing changed. The screaming continued, a desperate, ragged sound. But slowly, gradually, the rhythm of his cries began to falter. The high-pitched shrieks subsided into ragged sobs. His tightly shut eyes flickered open. They darted around the room, past his furious father, past his distraught mother, and landed on her, on the quiet woman humming in the corner. Anea didn't smile. She just kept humming, her gaze soft and steady. Leo's sobs began to quiet. He took his hands away from his ears. He was still trembling, his small body racked with the aftershocks of his panic, but the screaming had stopped. The silence that fell was more profound than any that had come before it. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to crawl out of the corner. He moved across the plush carpet, not toward his parents, but toward her. The Sterlings watched, frozen in disbelief. He crawled into Anea's lap, buried his face in her robe, and wrapped his small hands around the lavender-scented scarf at her neck. He held onto it like a lifeline. Anea stopped humming and simply held him, her hand resting gently on his back, feeling the frantic beat of his little heart gradually slow. Mr. Sterling took a step forward, his mouth open to say something, to command, to question, to dismiss. But for the first time, he seemed to have no words. He looked at the woman on the floor, this simple maid, who had done what no specialist or parent could do. She had brought his son back from the brink. The stakes in the house had just been irrevocably reset. Anea was no longer just the help. She was the only person who could quiet the storm, and that made her both indispensable and, to people like the Sterlings, incredibly dangerous. What would you do next? With this new, unspoken power, this fragile, desperate trust placed in your hands, how would you navigate the treacherous currents of this family? Anea understood that trust, with a child like Leo, wasn't built with grand gestures or promises. It was woven from 1,000 tiny, consistent threads of safety. Her quiet competence was not in her ability to clean, but in her ability to see and to care in a language that required no words. She began to establish gentle, unspoken routines, small anchors of kindness in his unpredictable world. Every morning after she made his bed, she would take his favorite toy, a worn, plastic Tyrannosaurus Rex, and place it on his pillow, facing the door, as if it were standing guard, waiting for his return. After his bath, while the mirror was still foggy with steam, she would use her finger to draw a small, smiling sun in the corner, a secret message that would greet him when he brushed his teeth. and after each of his draining afternoon therapy sessions, a warm cup of cocoa would be waiting for him in the kitchen, just as she had left it on that first day. These were small, almost invisible acts, but for Leo they were a lifeline. They were proof that he was seen, that his small world mattered, that someone was paying attention. He never acknowledged them out loud, but Anea saw the signs. She saw the way his eyes would flick to the pillow as soon as he entered his room, a tiny, almost imperceptible relaxing of his shoulders when he saw his dinosaur sentinel. She once saw him trace the outline of the smiling sun with his own small finger before it faded away. The change in Leo was subtle at first, but undeniable. He had fewer outbursts. He seemed less brittle. One of his tutors, a patient young woman named Miss Albright, was the first person to notice the pattern. "It's remarkable," she said to Mr. Sterling one afternoon, as Anea was quietly polishing the glass of the French doors nearby. "On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, he's a different child. He's calmer, more focused. He can actually retain what we're working on." Anea froze, her hand still on the glass. Those were her workdays. Mr. Sterling, who had been glancing at his watch, looked up with a flicker of interest. "Is that so? We started him with that new developmental specialist last month, Dr. Evans, costing a fortune, but it seems to be paying off." "Perhaps," Miss Albright said, her gaze drifting for a moment toward Anea. "But the shift is so specific to these days. It's as if something in his environment is making him feel safer on those particular days." Mr. Sterling dismissed it with a wave. "Dr. Evans provides us with a detailed weekly regimen. We're simply seeing the results of a structured, professional approach. Consistency." He said the word as if it were a corporate strategy, a data point on a chart proving his return on investment. He hadn't even considered the possibility that the environmental factor was a person, a maid, a woman he paid to be invisible. The small win, the external validation of her quiet work, was immediately and thoroughly undermined by his bias. He couldn't see the truth because he wasn't looking for it in her direction. Anea turned back to the glass, her expression unchanged. She polished away a small smudge, her own reflection looking back at her for a moment before she wiped it away too. She didn't need his validation. The proof of her work was in the boy who was slowly, quietly, beginning to heal. Her competence didn't need an audience. It needed only to be felt by the one person who mattered. The bond between Anea and Leo deepened in the quiet spaces of the house, away from the demanding eyes of his parents. It was a friendship built in whispers and shared glances. While she dusted the books in the library, he would sit on the floor, showing her pictures in a book about planets, his small finger tracing the rings of Saturn. He never spoke a full sentence, but he would make small sounds, a gasp of wonder at a picture of a nebula, a low hum of contentment as she worked nearby. He was relearning how to communicate, and Anea was his first and only audience. One rainy afternoon, they were in the sunroom, a space filled with plants that Mrs. Sterling had bought for their aesthetic value but never touched. Anea was gently wiping the leaves of a large fiddle-leaf fig, and Leo was watching the rain streak down the enormous panes of glass. He was quiet for a long time, his face pressed close to the window. Then he whispered it. "Sad." Anea paused, her cloth hovering over a leaf. She turned to him. "The rain," he nodded, his eyes wide. He pointed a small finger at the window. "The sky is crying." Anea's heart felt like it swelled in her chest. It was the most he had said in months. She knelt beside him, her presence warm and solid. "Sometimes," she said softly, "but you know what happens after the sky cries? The sun comes out and gives it a big, warm hug, and all the flowers get a drink so they can grow big and strong." He seemed to consider this, his brow furrowed. He looked from the rain to the plants surrounding them, then back to her. He reached out and with a startlingly gentle touch, his fingers found the edge of her lavender scarf. He rubbed the soft cotton between his thumb and forefinger, a familiar, self-soothing gesture. Anea was preparing to leave for the day. She had gathered her things and was standing by the service entrance when she felt a small tug on her uniform. It was Leo. He stood behind her, his grip tight on the fabric of her dress. His face was buried in the folds and his shoulders were shaking. She knelt down, her heart aching. "I will be back on Friday, little one," she whispered. "Just like always." He shook his head, his face still hidden. He held up his hand, clutching her scarf, which he must have gently pulled from her neck. He held it to his nose, inhaling the scent. His other hand was still fisted in her dress. He looked up at her then, his eyes shining with unshed tears, his expression one of desperate, absolute clarity. "Stay," he said. The word was not a whisper. It was clear. It was a plea. It was the first word he had spoken directly to another person in nearly a year. It was a command from a powerless boy to the only person in his world who held any real power over his well-being. That single word was a hinge upon which Anaya's entire world turned. This was no longer a job. It was not about a paycheck or fulfilling her duties. It was a profound moral obligation. This child had given her his trust, his voice. How could she possibly leave? If you were there, would you step closer or stay silent? For Anaya, there was no choice. She had already stepped closer, and now she knew she had to stay. Whatever the cost. The Sterling household operated on a simple, unspoken principle. Problems were solved by being outsourced. A leaky faucet was a problem for a plumber. A flagging stock was a problem for a broker. A silent, unhappy child was a problem for a therapist. For Alistair and his wife, acknowledging Anaya's role in Leo's improvement was tantamount to admitting their own failure, a failure of parenting, a failure of their philosophy that everything could be bought and managed. And so, they constructed a trap. It wasn't a trap with legal clauses or written rules. It was a trap of perception, a mirrored wall they built around Anaya's success. They could see the results of her work, a calmer, happier son, but they credited the reflection to someone else entirely. That someone was Dr. Evelyn Reed, the third and most expensive child psychologist they had hired. She was sharp, professional, and came with a glossy brochure of Ivy League credentials. "Dr. Reed's new sensory integration protocol is working wonders," Mrs. Sterling would announce at her charity luncheons. "Alistair and I have always believed in investing in the very best. We're seeing a 90% reduction in his episodes," Mr. Sterling would state in a phone call to his own father, his voice laced with the pride of a CEO discussing a successful quarter. "The data is trending positive." They spoke of Leo's healing as if it were a corporate turnaround, and Dr. Reed was the star consultant they had hired to execute it. Anaya, the one actually integrating the sensory comfort into his life, the warm cocoa, the soft lullabies, the lavender scent he clung to, was completely and deliberately erased from the narrative. She was just part of the background, the stage upon which Dr. Reed's protocol was performed. The trap was elegantly cruel. If Anaya were to speak up to say, "Actually, that was me. I was the one who sat with him. He speaks to me," she would be seen as insolent as a maid trying to claim a status far above her station. She would be fired for overstepping, for insubordination, for daring to suggest she could succeed where their money and expertise had failed. Her quiet, steady presence would be reframed as a manipulative campaign for attention. But if she stayed silent, as she was paid to do, she became complicit in her own erasure. Her bond with Leo, the purest thing in that house, would be used as evidence of Dr. Reed's brilliance. Her genuine care would be co-opted, repackaged, and presented as a billable hour. She was trapped by her own effectiveness. The better she was at her unspoken job of healing Leo, the more credit was lavished upon the expensive professionals, and the more invisible her own contribution became. She saw it most clearly one afternoon, when Dr. Reed was leaving after a session. The therapist stopped Anaya in the hall. "You're the housekeeper, right?" Dr. Reed asked, not unkindly. "I just want to commend you. The boy's parents mentioned you've been very good at sticking to the sensory regimen I designed. The consistent temperature of his drinks, the low-stimulus auditory environment. It's crucial that everyone on staff follows the plan. Your compliance is making a real difference." Anaya just nodded, the words catching in her throat. Her plan. The cocoa. The humming. It had all been observed, documented, and absorbed into the official, expensive narrative. She was being praised for following a set of instructions that had originated in her own heart. The mirrored wall was complete. On one side, a maid was quietly and intuitively caring for a child. On the other side, a highly paid doctor was implementing a brilliant therapeutic strategy. And no one, except for Anaya herself, knew they were looking at the exact same thing. The dinner party was small and exclusive. the kind of event the Sterlings hosted to maintain their intricate web of social and financial alliances. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of conversations about mergers and acquisitions. Anea moved through the periphery, refilling wine glasses, her movements fluid and unobtrusive, her face a neutral mask. Leo, who was usually in his room with a nanny during these events, had been brought out for a brief, curated appearance, a prop to project the image of a happy, functioning family. He sat at the polished mahogany table, dressed in an uncomfortable-looking suit, his small feet dangling high above the floor. He refused to eat. He pushed the meticulously arranged food around his plate with a silver fork, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond his father's shoulder. Anea knew that point. It was the doorway through which she moved back and forth from the kitchen. He was tracking her. "Leo, eat your salmon," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice a strained, smiling whisper that was meant for him but performed for her guests. Leo didn't respond. He slid off his chair and walked with unnerving calm to the edge of the dining room. He stood just inside the doorway, watching Anea as she collected empty plates. Then his voice, small but clear in a momentary lull in the conversation, cut through the room. "Anea, stay." Every head turned. The polite chatter died instantly. All eyes were on the small boy in the suit and the maid in the gray uniform. Mr. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of genial hospitality, hardened into granite. The embarrassment was a physical force, a wave of heat that radiated from him. One of the guests, a woman with diamonds at her throat, let out a small, tittering laugh. "How sweet," she said. "He's attached to the help." The words landed like a slap. Anea felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She wanted to disappear. Mr. Sterling strode over, took Leo firmly by the arm, and escorted him from the room, his apologies and forced laughter trailing behind him. The moment the last guest had departed, Mr. Sterling found her in the kitchen. His voice was low, but it vibrated with a cold, controlled fury. "What did you do?" he hissed. "Sir," Anea whispered, her hands clutching a dish towel. "Tonight was a calculated humiliation. You have encouraged this. Dependency. You have overstepped your bounds." He paced the length of the vast stainless steel kitchen, his movements like those of a caged tiger. "You are an employee. You are here to perform a function. You are not his friend. You are not his mother. You will maintain a professional distance from my son from now on. You will not speak to him unless spoken to. You will not engage him. Your job is to clean this house, not to insert yourself into the workings of my family." The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She had done nothing but show kindness. She had done nothing but answer a silent call for help, and she was being punished for her success. She was being isolated from the one person in this house she had managed to reach. It was a checkmate. He was using her compassion as a weapon against her. She could have quit. She could have walked out the door and never looked back. But the image of Leo's face, his eyes pleading with her to stay, was burned into her mind. What would you sacrifice to stay true? To stay true to the promise she had made to that little boy, a promise that had never been spoken but was understood between them. She would sacrifice her pride. She would endure the humiliation. She would accept the unjust punishment. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She made a quiet vow to the cold, sterile room. "I will not leave him. I will stay." The week leading up to the annual Sterling Foundation Gala was a symphony of orchestrated chaos. Florists, caterers, and event planners swarmed the penthouse, transforming it from a home into a lavish stage. The tension in the air was palpable, and it settled most heavily on Leo. His routines were shattered, his quiet spaces invaded by strangers. His anxiety manifested in a return to his old habits, the rigid alignment of his toys, the constant, nervous tremor in his hands. Mr. Sterling's order to maintain distance had been followed to the letter. Anea performed her duties with a silent, robotic efficiency. She cleaned Leo's room while he was with his tutors, her heart aching as she saw the distress in the tight clench of his bedsheets, the frantic, angry scribbles on his drawing pad. She could not speak to him, could not hum her soft lullabies, could not offer a warm cup of cocoa. She was a ghost in his life again, and she could see him starting to fade. But Anea had a plan. It was not a plan of confrontation or rebellion. It was a plan of quiet, subversive care, the only kind she could offer. The gala, the source of his current distress, would also be her proving ground. It was the ultimate test of the bond she had built, a bond they were trying to sever. The night before the gala, after everyone had gone to bed, Anea took a spare lavender scarf from her room. It was identical to the one she always wore, washed in the same gentle soap, imbued with the same calming scent. She folded it into a neat, small square. Moving silently through the darkened halls, she slipped into Leo's room. He was asleep, his breathing shallow and fitful. She gently lifted the corner of his pillow and tucked the folded scarf underneath, a hidden talisman, a secret thread of comfort for him to find. It was an act of faith, a message sent across the chasm of silence they had imposed between them. On the evening of the gala, the penthouse was unrecognizable. Hundreds of guests in tuxedos and glittering gowns drifted through the rooms, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. Anea was part of the uniformed catering staff, her gray maid's uniform swapped for a crisp black and white server's outfit. She was more invisible than ever, a nameless face in a sea of them, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. She saw Leo once, for a fleeting moment. He was standing beside his parents near the grand staircase, looking small and overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd. His eyes were wide with panic. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He looked like he was seconds away from shattering. Anea's heart went out to him. Find it, she prayed silently, sending the thought to him with all her might. Remember the scarf. She moved on, swallowed by the demands of the party, her face a mask of professional calm. But inside, she was holding her breath. She had placed her thread of comfort into the labyrinth of his fear. Now she could only wait and see if he would find it. This glittering, chaotic party was the stage, and the main event, the one that would change everything, was about to begin. The first sign that something was wrong was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The cheerful din of the party faltered, replaced by urgent, hushed whispers. Anea, clearing glasses from a table, saw Mrs. Sterling's face, a painted mask of social grace, crack with genuine panic. She saw Mr. Sterling speaking sharply into his phone, his jaw tight. The security guards, who had been stoic presences at the edges of the room, began to move with a new, sharp-eyed purpose. Then, the whispers solidified into a single, terrifying word that rippled through the crowd: Leo. He was gone. Panic, raw and unvarnished, erupted beneath the glittering surface of the gala. Staff were dispatched to search the guest suites. Security fanned out, their radios crackling. Mrs. Sterling was on the verge of hysterics, her carefully constructed composure dissolving into frantic sobs. Mr. Sterling was a pillar of cold, terrifying rage, barking orders, his face pale. The party had died. Anea stood frozen for a moment, a tray of empty glasses in her hands, while everyone else was searching the obvious places, the bedrooms, the balconies, the meteor room. She closed her eyes and thought not like an adult, but like a small, terrified boy. Where would you go to escape the noise? Where would you go to hide from the lights and the strange faces? You would go somewhere small, somewhere dark, somewhere familiar. She set the tray down on a nearby table and slipped away from the chaos. No one noticed her go. She was just a member of the staff, melting back into the shadows where she belonged. But she moved with a certainty that belied her station. She knew this house, its secret corners, its quiet places. And more importantly, she knew the boy. She bypassed the main living areas and headed for the service wing. She walked past the cavernous kitchen, past the staff break room, and down a narrow hall to a place no guest would ever see, the laundry room. The room was dark and quiet, the only sound the low hum of a dryer. It smelled of clean linen and lavender, the scent of the detergent she used for his bedding. And there in the far corner, tucked between a large wicker basket and the wall, was a small, huddled shape. It was Leo. He had his knees pulled up to his chest and his face was buried in something he was holding tightly in his hands. It was the scarf, her scarf. He had it pressed to his nose and mouth, his small body shuddering with silent sobs. He had found her thread of comfort in the dark. Anea didn't speak. She didn't rush toward him. She simply sat on the cool tile floor a few feet away, her back against a washing machine, and waited. After a few moments, he seemed to sense her presence. He lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and fearful. When he saw her, the fear was replaced by a wave of profound, soul-deep relief. She opened her arms and he scrambled into her lap, burying his face in her shoulder. She held him, rocking him gently, humming her soft, familiar lullaby. The public test, the moment of reversal, was happening here in the dark, in the smell of clean laundry, far from the eyes of the glittering crowd. Her quiet, intuitive care had succeeded where a full-scale security search had failed. After a few minutes, when his sobs had subsided and his breathing had evened out into the soft rhythm of sleep, she stood up, lifting him easily into her arms. He was a warm, trusting weight against her. She walked out of the service wing and back into the main hall. The search was still in full, frantic swing. A security guard saw her first, his eyes widening. "He's here," he shouted. The chaos converged on her, but just as Mr. Sterling, his face a mask of thunder, pushed through the crowd, he stopped dead. He saw her. He saw the maid in the simple black uniform, standing calmly in the eye of the storm. And in her arms, he saw his son, fast asleep, his face peaceful, one small hand clutching a familiar lavender scarf. The room fell silent. All the wealth, power, and influence in that space melted away. There was only the undeniable truth of the scene before them. The one person he had ordered to stay away was the only one his son had trusted to come home to. The power dynamic in the room and in the house had just been completely and irrevocably reversed. It was a moment so profound, so silent, so utterly cinematic, you could feel the shift in the air, literal goosebumps when he saw her. The gala ended not with applause, but with the quiet, shuffling departure of unnerved guests. The vast penthouse, moments before a stage for performative success, was now just a large, empty room, littered with the evidence of a party that had ended in failure. In the wake of the chaos, a new kind of silence settled over the house, one filled with questions and a heavy, dawning understanding. Anea had tucked Leo into his bed, the lavender scarf still loosely held in his sleeping hand. She was preparing to retreat to her own room, to fade back into the invisibility she was so accustomed to, when Mr. Sterling appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. His bow tie was undone, his expensive jacket was slung over a chair, and the look on his face was one of profound, hollowed-out exhaustion. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, bewildering confusion. He looked at her not as an employee, but as a puzzle he couldn't solve. "He wouldn't let anyone else near him," he said, his voice raspy. "Not me, not his mother. The moment he woke up, he started asking for you." Anea simply nodded, waiting. He walked over to the large steel island and leaned against it, running a hand through his hair. "All my life," he began, speaking more to himself than to her, "I have operated on a single principle: identify the problem, acquire the best tool to fix it. The best schools, the best doctors, the best security. I bought the best of everything for him." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a genuine, desperate need to understand. "What do you want?" It was the question she had been expecting. He was reverting to his nature. This was a transaction. She had something he needed, a connection to his son, and he was prepared to pay for it. He expected her to ask for a raise, a new title, a bonus for her performance. He was offering her a reward for services rendered. Anea looked at this powerful, broken man, and for the first time she felt not fear or intimidation, but a wave of profound pity. He still didn't understand. She took a quiet breath. "I don't want anything, sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. He frowned. "Everyone wants something." "I want Leo to be happy," she replied simply. "I want him to feel safe. I want him to know that he is heard even when he isn't speaking." This was her choice of soft justice. No revenge, no demands. No, "I told you so." Just a simple, unyielding focus on the well-being of the child. She was not leveraging her position for personal gain. She was leveraging it for him. What does real justice look like here? It didn't look like a financial settlement. It looked like healing. Alistair Sterling stared at her, and something inside his carefully constructed worldview seemed to crack. He was a master of negotiation, of finding an opponent's price. But she wasn't an opponent, and she didn't have a price. She was simply there for his son. He finally pushed himself off the counter and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unwavering. The authority was gone, replaced by a reluctant, dawning respect. "The first day you were here," he said slowly, the memory surfacing. "I told you that you were here to clean." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating gesture. "I was wrong." He looked past her toward the hallway that led to his son's room. "You're not here to clean." You're here because you stayed." The words were an admission, an apology, a surrender. It was the moment the old rules of the house were officially declared dead. Anea was no longer just the help. She was the anchor, and a new, unspoken contract had just been drafted between them. In the days that followed the gala, the entire ecosystem of the Sterling household was quietly but fundamentally rewritten. The change wasn't announced in a staff meeting or formalized in a memo. It began with a single, unprecedented action. Mr. Sterling canceled his son's appointments with Dr. Reed. "We will be pursuing an alternative wellness strategy," was all his assistant was instructed to say. The expensive brochures and complex therapeutic protocols vanished. The army of specialists was, for now, dismissed. Alternative wellness strategy was Anea. Mr. Sterling approached her not as a boss giving orders but as a student seeking guidance. "What does he need?" he would ask. "What should we be doing?" He, who directed boards and managed billion-dollar assets, was asking a maid for a plan. Anea's proposals were not complex or expensive. They were simple, intuitive, and centered on creating an environment of safety and trust. "He needs routine," she explained. "Not a schedule, but a rhythm. He needs to know what to expect. And he needs you. He needs to know you are not just a loud voice or a man who is leaving." This was the beginning of the systemic change. The first and most crucial policy to be rewritten was the family's own behavior. Mr. Sterling began coming home earlier. He started a new ritual, sitting on the floor with Leo and Anea for 15 minutes each evening, simply building with blocks. No phones or loud talk allowed. Mrs. Sterling, taking her cue from her husband, began to ask Anea for advice on Leo's meals, her tone stripped of its former condescension. But Anea knew that for the change to be lasting, it had to be more than just a shift in attitude. It needed to be codified to protect not just her, but anyone who might come after her. She saw the risk if she were to leave. The Sterlings might simply revert to their old ways, hiring another army of specialists and overlooking the next quiet, intuitive caregiver who walked through their door. So when Mr. Sterling offered to formalize her new role with a significant salary increase, she agreed, but with one condition. "I would like a new title," she said. "Not for me, for the role." "Anything," he said. "Head of household, domestic manager." "No," Anea replied gently. "I would like the position to be called child wellness companion, and I would like the job description to state that the companion's primary duty is to observe, support, and advocate for the child's emotional well-being, and that they are to be included in all consultations regarding the child." It was a masterful stroke of quiet, systemic reform. By naming the policy and defining its terms, she was ensuring that the value of the role was officially recognized. She was creating a permanent structural space for caregiving within the household hierarchy. The person in this role would no longer be just the help. They would be a designated advocate, an essential part of the child's support system, with their expertise officially acknowledged and required. Mr. Sterling had his HR department draft the contract immediately. The change was specific, enforceable, and it prevented the same kind of harm, the dismissal of quiet competence, from happening again. The invisible, emotional labor she had been performing was now visible, valued, and protected. The system hadn't just bent to accommodate her, she had rebuilt a small part of it to be more humane. The healing of the Sterling household was most evident not in the grand, silent rooms of the penthouse, but down below, in the small, neglected garden on the terrace. It had been a space designed for show, filled with architectural plants that required little care. Now, it was becoming a space for living. One bright, sunny afternoon, Anea brought up small trowels and bags of soil and a flat of vibrantly colored pansies. She and Leo spent the afternoon on their knees, digging in the dirt. For the first time, Leo's hands were not clenched or trembling but covered in rich, dark earth. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh when a worm wriggled over his fingers. Anea showed him how to gently loosen the roots of the small flowers and settle them into their new home. This was their new therapy. No sterile offices, no probing questions. Just the sun on their backs and the simple, grounding act of helping something grow. As they worked, a shadow fell over them. It was Mr. Sterling. He had come home early, his suit jacket already off, his tie loosened. In the past, his presence would have shattered the fragile peace. Leo would have frozen, the laughter dying on his lips. But now the boy just glanced up, smiled, and went back to patting the soil around a purple pansy. Mr. Sterling watched them for a long moment. He didn't direct or supervise. He simply observed the quiet, easy rhythm of their work. Then, to Anaya's surprise, he knelt down in the dirt, his expensive trousers be damned. "Show me," he said, his voice quiet. Anaya passed him a small trowel. He took it, his grip clumsy and unfamiliar. She showed him how to dig a small hole, how to be firm but gentle. He listened with the focused attention of a man learning a new, critical skill. They worked in a comfortable silence for a while, the three of them, a small team tending to a small patch of earth. After they had planted the last flower, Mr. Sterling sat back on his heels, looking at the bright patches of color that now dotted the formerly sterile garden. He hadn't smiled like that in a year, he said softly, his gaze fixed on his son, who was now gently watering the new plants. The words were a confession, a quiet acknowledgement of all the time that had been lost. Anaya felt a sense of profound peace settle over her. This was her personal healing. It wasn't about the new title or the bigger salary. It was about this moment. It was about the dignity of being seen, not as a functionary, but as a person whose wisdom was valued. She had not only helped a child find his voice and a father find his son, but in the process, she had fully and quietly reclaimed her own definition. She was not a maid who had gotten lucky. She was a healer. And this garden, once a symbol of the family's cold aesthetic, was now the first, tangible proof of her work. It was a place where things could finally, truly grow. Alistair Sterling was a man who understood investment, and he now saw Anaya as the single best investment he had ever made. His first instinct, born of a lifetime in the corporate world, was to reward her in a way the world would understand, with a grand, public gesture. "The Sterling Foundation is launching a new wing for pediatric mental health," he announced to her one morning in his home office. "I want you to run it. We'll give you a corner office, a staff, a 7-figure budget. We'll put your name on the door." It was a breathtaking offer, a life-changing opportunity. It was the kind of recognition most people dreamed of. But Anaya saw the flaw in it. He was trying to turn her into a savior, to put her on a pedestal. Her power, however, had never come from a position of authority. It had come from quiet, hands-on care. She smiled gently and shook her head. "Thank you, sir. That is more than generous, but my work is not in an office." He was taken aback. "But this is a chance to help thousands of children." "There is another way," she said. She then laid out her own proposal. It was not a grand, top-down initiative. It was small, local, and deeply personal. She proposed using a small portion of that budget to create Anaya's Nests, sensory-friendly quiet rooms in local schools and community centers. These wouldn't be clinical therapy rooms, but warm, welcoming spaces filled with things she knew worked: soft blankets, calming music, scent diffusers with lavender oil, bins of sand and smooth stones to touch, and a small library of picture books. She also proposed a training program, not for doctors, but for teachers, librarians, and community volunteers, people already on the ground. She would teach them her methods, how to use a quiet voice, how to create a routine, how to recognize the signs of sensory overload, how to simply be with a child in distress without needing to fix them. Her idea was not to build a monument to herself, but to distribute her knowledge. She was sharing the credit, empowering a community instead of consolidating power. The recognition she was seeking was not for herself as a hero, but for her method as a valid and effective tool. Mr. Sterling listened, a look of dawning admiration on his face. He had offered her a title, but she was building a legacy. He had offered her power, but she was choosing to give it away. "Done," he said without a moment's hesitation. "We'll fund it, all of it, and you will oversee it, not from an office, but from wherever you need to be." Her new role at the foundation was not that of an executive, but of an architect and a teacher. She spent her days in schools and community centers, her hands in the dirt of community gardens, her voice a calm and reassuring presence as she trained others. She had avoided the trap of becoming a symbol and had instead become a source. Her recognition was quiet, earned, and utterly authentic, and it was already helping to build a world with more safe spaces for children like Leo. Anaya's office at the Sterling Foundation was nothing like the grand, imposing spaces the other executives occupied. It was a small, sunlit room on the ground floor with a door that opened directly onto a children's sensory garden. There was no large desk, just a comfortable armchair, a low table, and shelves filled with picture books and smooth gray stones. People didn't come here for meetings, they came to talk. She no longer wore a uniform. Her clothes were simple, comfortable, and practical, soft sweaters and cotton trousers. She looked less like an employee and more like what she was, a gardener, a teacher, a source of calm. On the wall opposite her chair, there was only one piece of art. It was a simple, square frame of pale wood. Inside, mounted on a clean white background, was a soft, worn, lavender-colored cotton scarf. It was the scarf from the gala, the thread of comfort, the symbol that had changed everything. Visitors would often ask about it. "That's a lovely textile," a wealthy donor once remarked. "Is it from a local artisan?" Anea would just smile. "It's a reminder," she would say, "of where our work began." The object's meaning had been completely transformed. What had once been a private, hidden symbol of her identity, a small piece of home she carried into a sterile world, had become a public testament to her philosophy. It had started as an emblem of her invisible labor, something she tucked into her collar out of sight. It became a lifeline in the dark for a terrified child. Now it was an anchor, a quiet foundational statement in the room where she helped guide the foundation's work. Did the object's meaning change for you too? For Anea, it held the entire journey. It represented the power of quiet, consistent care. It was a symbol of how the smallest, most overlooked things, a soft piece of fabric, a familiar scent, a gentle hum, could be more powerful than all the money and authority in the world. It was a reminder that true strength often came not in the form of a sword, but in the form of a shield, a comfort, a safe place to land. One afternoon, Leo, now a bit older and taller, came to her office after school to help her water the plants in the garden. He looked at the framed scarf on the wall, a familiar sight to him. "It looks so small in there," he said thoughtfully. Anea smiled and touched the cool glass of the frame. "It was big enough when it needed to be," she replied. The scarf on the wall was the echo of her journey. It was a quiet, daily reminder that she had walked into a cold, silent house not to clean it, but to change it. And she had. She had stayed. And in doing so, she had prepared herself, and the world around her, for a future where gentleness was finally recognized as the profound strength it had always been. Years passed. The Sterling Foundation's nests became a celebrated model for community-based childcare, quietly expanding to cities across the country. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, humbled and changed by their journey with their son, became passionate, hands-on advocates for the Foundation's work. The penthouse, once a sterile museum of wealth, was now a home, filled with the comfortable clutter of a teenager's life and the sound of easy, genuine laughter. The final scene of the story unfolds not at a glittering gala, but at a small, intimate gathering in the family's living room. Leo, now 16, stands before a small group of family and close friends. He is tall and confident, his father's sharp features softened by his mother's gentle eyes. In his hands, he holds a speech for a school competition, the final draft of which he had practiced with Anea just the day before. Anea sits in an armchair nearby, no longer an employee but a cherished, essential part of the family. She is grayer now, her hands creased with the lines of a life well lived, but her eyes hold the same calm, observant wisdom. Leo clears his throat and begins to read. His essay is about the definition of a hero. He speaks of the loud, obvious heroes, the soldiers, the saviors, the titans of industry like his father. But then his tone shifts. "But I learned about a different kind of hero," he says, his voice clear and steady. "A quiet hero. The hero who doesn't ride in to save the day, but who is already there, waiting for you when the day falls apart. The hero who doesn't use a loud voice, but whose whisper can calm a storm. My hero taught me that the biggest battles are not fought with swords, but with patience, and that the greatest strength is not the power to command, but the power to stay." He looks up from his paper, his eyes finding Anea in the crowd. A slow, warm smile spreads across his face. "My hero doesn't wear a cape," he says, his voice thick with emotion. "She wears a lavender scarf. I don't remember all the things she taught me, but I remember the most important one: you don't have to be loud to be strong. You just have to stay." He finishes his speech. The room is perfectly still for a moment, the emotional impact of his words settling over everyone. Then Alastair Sterling stands up and begins to applaud, his eyes shining with tears. The small room erupts in heartfelt applause, but the camera rests on Anya. She isn't clapping. She's just smiling, a soft, private smile of profound, quiet joy. Her legacy was never going to be a name on a building. It was this. It was the confident, happy young man standing before her. It was the loving family that surrounded him. It was the permanent, indelible change she had wrought through nothing more than her presence, her patience, and her unwavering belief in the power of quiet care. The final image is one of stillness, of dignity, of a room that had been fundamentally and forever changed. The question that lingers, soft as a whisper, is a simple one: whose quiet presence changed the very foundation of your world?